Recently, there has been a lot of focus on India's federalism in public discourse. We come across two divergent views. One is that India has too much federalism, as witnessed during this pandemic, when states asserted their autonomy to the extent of barring Indians from other states from accessing their medical facilities, sealing their borders to each other, and going their own separate ways in rulemaking. The ensuing confusion emboldened the view that greater regional autonomy is likely to aggravate the chaos that India is already known for. To move forward, India needs strong and decisive leadership at the center. Then there is a polar opposite view that a nation as vast and diverse as India cannot be governed through centralized planning and one size fits all approach. Many observers are alarmed at what they see as growing dominance of the center over the states in administrative, financial, and legislative domains. They point to the severe national lockdown of 2020 imposed unilaterally by the center without consultation with states, followed next year by the rollout of vaccine program branded and controlled entirely by the center, despite public health being an exclusively state matter. Both views seem to agree on only one thing, that the dynamics between the center and the states is changing in India. Should we be concerned? To make sense of India's evolving center-state relations, we have with us a panel of highly eminent experts.
Thank you. Yes, I think the way you have posed the question, one needs to get some conceptual clarity on what kind of federal system we have. And I would make two initial points here. One, that there is no universal model of federal systems. There have been in the past, certain federal systems have developed and have been reference points when other federal systems have been created. Which is why when the Indian Constitution was being drawn up, the primary reference point was the American federal system, but that was not the only one. The Constituent Assembly looked at the others and in fact crafted a very carefully thought out variant of federalism, which they felt would be suitable for Indian conditions. The model you refer to being the dominant model, we got characterized as a quasi-federal state. I think that terminology should be discarded. We are federal in a different way, and this model of federalism is what we are going to discuss. The second point I would want to make here at the outset is that federalism and decentralization are not the same thing. Federalism is opposed to another kind of state structure called the unitary state, which India was largely under colonial rule. Decentralization is opposed to centralization. And therefore, you can have centralized federal systems and decentralized unitary systems, and then the whole range of variants possible. So the third point that you referred to in your opening remarks is whether there can be too little or too much of federalism. Now, federalism is one of those systems of government which do not create diversity, which do not engender regionalism. It merely provides a framework for organizing diversities so that they coexist within a single polity. So now, to argue that there's too much or too little, perhaps is confusing the issue where too much means too much regionalism or too little. So I think we need to keep these conceptual categories aside. The second point that I would like to make is that the Constitution was very carefully crafted to balance these concerns. It is a union, it is a federal union, and the way in which the powers of the center and the states were incorporated in the Constitution is something of a marvel when one looks back at it, because they thought of almost everything. What has happened over the last 74 years or last 72 is that the way in which the Constitution has been worked, and Ambedkar warned us about it. He says, this is not a text which can stand on its own. It's the people who work it who will determine how it shapes up. That the working of the Constitution, the changes, the amendments, but more than that, the way in which federalism has been viewed and perceived by those who are entrusted with the responsibility of making it work, I think we have to look in that direction to find out whether we have made a good job of it or have made a mess of it. And I think your reference to the pandemic would seem to indicate that unilateral, centrally imposed lockdowns or even demonetization and the vacillation over the vaccine policy, dual market, two prices for center and for state. So all that throws the ball back at how can you make cooperative federalism work.
I'm not a professor, I'm not a scholar, I'm just a civil servant with some experience and have been at the receiving end of federalism and or anti-federalism. But my stand is very clear that the very first line of the Indian Constitution is that India, that is Bharat, shall be a union of states. For me, period. So there is no ambiguity about it, that it's a union of states. And therefore, to treat states as appendages and of no consequence or any effort which has happened over the years to ride roughshod over the state, all governments at all times, that has been the tendency, and which needs to be resisted. And many times, Supreme Court has come to the rescue of the state. Now, one interesting point I would like to mention, that while federalism was being discussed and when Indian election system, election commission was being discussed, one very important exception was made to federalism. Why should the state legislative elections be held by a federal election commission? Because the feedback which the Constituent Assembly received was that in every state there are some outsiders, and those outsiders are being maltreated, and they are being kept out of the electoral roll so that they do not have any say in the political power. So to guard against that, a very far-sighted step was taken, that this state elections were also brought under the Federal Election Commission, which is Election Commission of India. Of course, the Panchayat elections, the local body elections, are controlled by the State Election Commission, which is an independent body. Now, third point, I would like to say that even the Supreme Court has upheld the federal character of the nation. In as far back as 1972, when I was, or was it 73, when I was in the Administrative Academy and we were being taught law, Keshav-Nand Bharti case came, which determined 5 basic features of the Constitution. And of the 5 basic features, the number 5 was the federal character of India's constitution. That means it cannot be tinkered with. It's a basic structure. Now, later on, again, Supreme Court in S.R. Bommai case also reiterated the same thing, that the federal character has to be respected. Now, Article 356, through which empowered the central government to dismiss the elected governments of the state, has been abused extensively throughout the year, till about 10 years ago, when I think one was Uttarakhand and another was perhaps Meghalaya, some state in the northeast, when, or was it Arunachal, when the Supreme Court turned Article 356, the enforcement there, upside down and brought back the assembly. So after that, of course, the government of the day, the central government has been very wary of abusing this power. Now, growing dominance, which leads to increased friction, is something which we notice. Now, one debate which has been going on for the last 6-7 years, the Prime Minister's demand that there should be a debate on simultaneous election. If he had his way, he would have imposed it. But he does realize that there are constitutional constraints, there are legal constraints, it will not be easy. And now, simultaneous election, one nation, one election. Why? Why? Just for the convenience of the election commission, or the convenience of the political leadership that they have to go again and again? Who asked the Prime Minister to go to and campaign in the states? He should run the country. So now, because he has to to go again and again, and he feels that that is taking his time, so he demands that there should be one nation, one election. Now, why should now suppose we have created a situation when we had established one nation, one election? What if the Lok Sabha loses majority, as happened in 1998, and then does it mean that we all 28 states which have come to power through the good election with absolute majority, they should also go to the poll? Why? Because 10 MPs were bought over, or some party they left the coalition. Now it makes no sense. And secondly, now simultaneous election, if some in Tamil Nadu or Bengal or somewhere, the government falls for some reason, why should the other 27 get affected? So they are independent constituent bodies of the union, and they have been elected democratically. Why should they be disturbed? Now, one argument given in favor of simultaneous election is that, the people are very smart, the voter is very intelligent. Mind you, 300 million people are illiterate, and voter is very intelligent, and he will make a distinction, or she will make a distinction between what is a national issue and a local issue, and will vote independently, separately. That is too simplistic and too presumptuous an argument. And in fact, I have the data in front of me. From 1989, 31 states went to poll, and 77% of them voted as per the national issues. And because they were voting for some party for the Lok Sabha, they voted for the same party in the state election. Because an ordinary voter, once he has made up his mind in favor of a party, he's not going to then split issue by issue and say, okay, for Lok Sabha, I choose this party, for Vidhan Sabha, I choose another party. For most Indians, that is not how the mind will work. As shown that 77% of the country went exactly, which is why this demand is being made for simultaneous election, to make it into a kind of a presidential form of election. Now, recently there was a demand for postponement of election because of COVID. And I have said it in various media events that the Constitution of India allows for postponement of election only in 3 emergencies. war, external aggression, or internal rebellion. So none of these apply to today's condition. So why should the election be postponed? Because if it doesn't suit some party politically at any point, so they try to postpone and find an excuse. So that is not possible. Constitution has made it very clear that the Vidhan Sabha, every state assembly has a fixed term, and it will be allowed to stay there till the last day. But beyond that day, for one day, it cannot stay, then automatically the House stands dissolved. Then another issue which has been recently mentioned by the government and the Prime Minister about the common electoral roll. There I agree with him that since we as voters in India, whether we are voting for our village panchayat or for provincial assembly, Vidhan Sabha or the Lok Sabha, I'm the same voter. So, and the polling station is the same, the machine which conducts the election is the same, the security apparatus is the same. So why, why should there be two separate roles? And what we see is that my name is there in Vidhan Sabha, and a month later, panchayat elections are happening. My name is missing. Why should it be missing? So therefore, a common role is possible, and that is where Professor Arora mentioned about cooperative federalism. That is where we need cooperation. That although panchayat election is a total jurisdiction of the state, but then common electoral is a beneficial for everybody. So what we can do is we can have a common electoral roll. I, as an election commissioner of India, do not need the ward in the village. Which ward Professor Arora lives in is not my concern. The entire village is one booth for me, and he is there, and that is what I know. That's fine. But if I go lower the panchayat election, they can unmask the data. So we can have the same data masked for me and unmasked for the state. I think that is the solution which we should work on, because that is cooperative federalism and good for the country. Now, I was reading from your notes also that GST has made the state dependent on the center. Now, the taxes which they raise on their sales tax, and they are begging the center, please give us money, please release our money, and government is as if it is dishing out doles. Now, that is absolutely not acceptable, and there will be a reaction. So, cooperative federalism demands that after all, by great persuasion, you made the states surrender their financial autonomy of tax collection by accepting a GST. But follow it up with the cooperative federalism principle and release the money as soon as it falls due. Now, again, as Professor Arora mentioned, that in COVID, the states were made to play second fiddle. A lot can be discussed on that, can be debated. And finally, current debate which we are seeing in the paper almost on a daily basis for the last 10 days is the IAS, the All India Services, IAS, IPS, and the Indian Forest Service. Now, the Constitution, and I think it is Article 312 perhaps, it says that the Article 312, yes, that these services are common to the center and the states. I was in the IAS, I was selected by the central government because it's an all India competitive exam, allotted to a cadre called Haryana, and that I call this my parent cadre. Now, how can I be separated from my parent? So my parent cadre is the one to which I was allotted. And since I'm common to the state and the center, I come on deputation to the center, mind you, not on a posting, but on deputation, which obviously implies clearly that I belong somewhere else and I'm just coming temporarily on deputation. So, to play havoc with that. And it started on, unfortunately, very petty considerations are playing their role. What happened was that a chief secretary of West Bengal, along with the chief minister, did not attend Prime Minister's meeting. Now, obviously, chief secretary is working under the chief minister, And if she says puts him on another duty, and so he cannot attend, he can't be present both places. So he had been given 3-month extension on his retirement. He was retiring the next day. He was given 3-month extension because he was doing a COVID work, COVID relief work. And out of anger, central government ordered that please report to us tomorrow in Delhi. Why the hell will he report to Delhi the next day? And in fact, I once pointed out, if you see the Disaster Management Act, there is a clause which says that anybody who interferes with the work of a COVID official is committing a criminal offense which carries an imprisonment of 2 years. Now, a chief secretary who was given extension yesterday because he is working on COVID, and if he's unseated, dislocated from there, anybody who issued that order had committed an offense under the National Disaster Management Act, and a criminal offense at that, which carries 2 years punishment. So now they think that they can order any IAS officer to come at their will, without the officer's will, without the state's will, is going to play havoc with Sardar Patel in the scheme of things. Let me remind you, and I'll finish on that. All India services have played a great role in keeping India together. Imagine the man from Tamil Nadu going to Assam and at the age of 21, and he's spending 40 years of his life. He's the guy who's keeping the country united. So they go from one place to the other and spend their life in another state. Otherwise, just as electoral roll, only the locals will be appointed, will be registered. Similarly, only the locals will rule the rules. Now, this All India service actually has kept the country united, and that should not be allowed to be disturbed for petty considerations of ego. Now, ego is anti-federalism, and we must abandon it.
Let me get this very straight, that national integration according to the Constitution of India is not threatened, because India is a union of states, and no state, constituent state, have the right to secede. That is very much given in Article 1. So I really will not take that argument, as Mr. Qureshi rightly pointed out, that India is a union of states. So national integration, even the Constitution framers were very aware of, and I remember that the Constitution was being written on the background of a partition. So, the unions, this kind of an argument that India will secede, I think it's not constitutionally valid. So, the second point I would like to say that, the balance of cultural diversity, linguistic, religious, ethnic diversity, which India is, it is an, in that sense, an amalgamation of a very, very plural society. I think the Constitution, through different articles, like, of course, the 5th and the 6th schedule, and also, the spirit of accommodation was very much, it is still very much, living, it's a living document. So it is not something that was written and, it can be stored, but it's an evolving written document. And both integration and accommodation were taken care of by the Constitution framers. It is another thing when you talk about, because you started with the question, and I was just thinking that you cannot quantify something like federalism. It's not quantifiable. It's not like some kind of of course, people keep on generating data, but I don't think everything can be quantified, looking from the federal perspective. So in that sense, the distribution of powers between the center and the state is very, of course, India is bent towards the center. And, it was also as Professor Arora rightly pointed out, it was, Casey Ware who said it's not at all a federal country. It's a quasi-federal at the most. But that has changed. I would call it a very, very differential federal system, right? But at the same time, the question is not about India's sovereignty, because at the most what the states have is autonomy, and autonomy in their internal affairs, right? Now, having said that, I would like to point out that whichever government came, post 1952, Article 356 have been abused. So the office of the governor has been abused, and whichever party, if you are a party which is different than the party of the central government, it has been, we have seen lots of precedents rule, which was changed, I think, specifically from 1990s. We see a shift in Indian politics with the advent of coalition politics. Regional parties not only become important in their own region, or in demanding their linguistic cultural diversities or rights, or language become, their language should also be secured in the Constitution 7-8 schedule, but at the same time they become national partners, right? And that is the time, from 1990s onwards, that we start talking about things like cooperative federalism. And a lot has been written on cooperative federalism. And in fact, if you see, I'm not saying that, cooperative federalism is flourishing, not at all. On the contrary, what has happened is that, one had thought that regional parties becoming important at the national level is going to give some kind of what should I say, like more power will come to the state. And this more power is not something the center government giving, it's already there in the constitution. But what has happened contrary in the past few years is that cooperative federalism, the very essence of cooperative federalism, the very spirit of cooperative federalism has been attacked. And I'll just give you a few examples. Now, I'm not saying that regional parties are not important, right? So, because that cultural diversity, linguistic diversity of the country is very, very important. And, even our home minister, when he made the statement on Hindi Divas, 3 years back, and then again in 2019, I remember that just after the statement about Hindi being the common language, the national language, he changed his statement. Okay, so it was an overnight change. So even a very dominant centrist, a party like the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is the most dominant, among the NDA coalition, cannot actually roughshod cultural linguistic diversity of this country, because that kind of statement coming just the next day that no, this was not what I meant. Okay, all languages of India are very, very important. So regional parties are important, but there has been a complete roughshodding over the state's power. We have seen what has happened, because the constitution, I think there are certain interpretations and certain loopholes where the central government have come up. I will just take 2-3 examples. One is the first NDA and the second NDA 2, that is 2014 onwards and 2019 onwards. These two are very, very different. 2014 onwards, when Mr. Modi came to power, I still remember that apart from Achhe Din, there was also this notion of cooperative federalism, right? So, the slogan was cooperative federalism, Team Modi. I remember that Team Modi coming again and again on the television. And there was an expectation that, this will happen. But if you see the, the trajectory, this has not actually happened. What we have seen is, for example, during the pandemic, you had the passing of the national education policy. Okay, now the national education policy, it's for the entire nation, and education policy also comes under the state list. There was no discussion with the states on something as critical as education. Okay, it was just passed, and it was, it was advertised and passed. I have no clue whether it will be discussed ever or not. Or, on the question of labor code, like 29 labor laws where, of course, the government gave this kind of an argument that, we are streamlining, and, there are gig workers and economic development is different. Economy has changed due to the pandemic. So we need to streamline the laws, and they introduced the 3 labor codes. But again, labor is a very important subject under the state list, and the states were never informed. They were, there was no discussion in the parliament, right, about the labor codes, which affect most of us. So these are, some of the examples over the years which we are seeing. And in fact, one important thing which I'm like, we are thankful that, Supreme Court intervened, was the National Judicial Appointment Commission. the complete abandonment of the judicial collegium, and with this NJAC, which thankfully was the case came to Supreme Court, and Supreme Court said, no, this is a basic the basic structure of the Indian Constitution, that the Supreme Court or the courts, the independent impartial court, is very important, and you cannot have a appointment commission. So in that sense, I think if you see India's trajectory of federalism, it is not as if it was too federalism or too less federalism. I think right now what needs to be done, and what we have seen over the period, is there is a complete roughshodding towards a very, very prominent and dominant centralist kind of a policy, that so if you are this, of course the same thing coming back, that and it's not through Article 356, it's through GST, it is through different kind of systems, like for example the fiscal federalism. Finances do not go there to the state. The GST has not been shared. And even in matters like you were talking about the pandemic, Yajur, and you said that how the states blocked their boundaries. I think they were left with no other option in some ways, because they were completely unaware that within a gap of 2 or 3 hours there will be a nationwide lockdown, and then there will be a massive exodus of internal migrants moving from one state to another. They were completely unaware of it. So, in my view, I think, when you talk about cultural linguistic diversity, I think Indian federalism and federal India is the most important pillar. And anybody who says that, more federalism will lead to regionalism, I'm sorry, I cannot take that kind of an argument, because then, we do not have, no state has the right to secede. So how is it? Even in the Northeast, you can see that, there was earlier, they used to say, okay, Khalistan, or Northeast, Assam. There can be internal problems, right? But there is nothing that cannot be sorted out through proper negotiation, negotiations and strategy. That is something, that is the spirit and essence of federalism. And we have just, over the years, not only interstate council has been abandoned, we don't know about the finance commission, what is happening, which was one of the good bodies, talking about the finances of the state and the center. And, the office of the governor has been completely politicized. What has happened during the elections, we have also seen. So I would not say that, the linguistic cultural diversity, yes, those states do have those language, the language, the culture, and the Constitution of India actually takes care of all that. It is not as if, it is actually not following the Constitution, I think, which might lead to it, or changing that, any bill, declaring a bill as a money bill, and forcefully getting it passed, because you have the majority in the Lok Sabha. I think those are the things which are now becoming a big problem for India's federalism. So
I think a certain amount of conflict between center and states is inevitable in federal systems, and up to a point, I think it's actually quite healthy, because it enables people to thrash out differences by democratic means, possibly by accommodation, usually, I think, by accommodation. I cannot improve on the comments that Professor Arora began with in his descriptions of federalism and so on. It was an elegant and very helpful presentation. And I am one of those people who thinks that federalism is quite a good thing in a country with as much diversity as India has. India as a nation has greater social, cultural, topographical, economic diversity than most other federal systems do, much more than, say, the Germans, the Canadians, the Australians, the Americans. And in such a diverse country, I think federalism is really an essential element in making the system work well and helping the country to flourish. But when we have this discussion today, I think we need to pay attention to current conditions to see the situation in which we are discussing Indian federalism. Mr. Qureshi was right in saying that many central governments in federal systems many central governments in India over the years have inserted themselves into the state list, have eaten away at some of the powers of the states, and there's been a kind of creeping attempt at centralization. But I think we have to recognize that two central governments in India's history have been much more radical in attacking the federal system than that, much more. And those two governments were Mrs. Indira Gandhi's government and then the current government. And both of them were attacking federalism radically for the same purpose. And that is the drive for top-down control from the apex of the system. But the current effort to attack and centralize power and attack the federalism is much more systematic and much more radical than Mrs. Indira Gandhi's earlier attempt, which is rather like all things where Sanjay Gandhi was involved, it was rather ill-organized. And the current attack on federalism by the government of India is very different even from the policies of Atal Bihari Vajpayee's BJP and his NDA governments. This is a different kind. It's not the BJP that's doing this. It's this government, this BJP government. And we've heard a lot about some of the elements of the attack. It's true, and it's very welcome that Article 356, which used to be abused in imposing president's rule and so on. Article 356 is less of a problem now than it used to be because of a 1994 Supreme Court ruling, historic ruling in the Bomai case that restrained the abuse of that article. But there are many other things going on. The pursuit of simultaneous elections of states and central government is clearly an idea put forward by a government whose prime minister is very popular and can win elections, but whose party seems to be unable to win state elections in many states. It's a long string of state elections in which the BJP has fallen short. We see the intrusions upon state subjects in the state list in the Constitution. That's been mentioned. We see the problem with the central government making payments under the GST system. We see attempted changes in the management of the IAS and other central government services in order to empower the center at the expense of the states. We see the state governors being used in a partisan manner, which used to happen under Indira Gandhi quite a lot. Now it's happening again. We see the central government and the ruling party refusing to accept opposition victories in state elections, using inducements for defections from regional and opposition parties in order to enable the BJP to form state governments. And we see the controversy about the central police forces deployments. There are other things too. This is a rather long list. And in other words, the attack on federalism is actually happening on many fronts. And it's important that we understand that and consider whether that's healthy.
I think a lot of the issues that Dr. Mehna and Dr. Qureshi and Papia have highlighted provide us the framework for deciding what could be the way forward. I think it's very clear that federalism is under attack. It's not the first time, as Dr. Mehna pointed out, but it is certainly the first time that it has been attacked in such a sustained manner, because the Indira Gandhi's attack was through the 42nd Amendment during a short-lived emergency. If we compare, and I think this is an interesting point that arose, Papia mentioned it, if we compare the NDA 1 with the NDA 2 and the NDA 3, the difference is stark. NDA 1, after much difficulty, and it's all to the credit of Mr. Vajpayee, managed to pull together a coalition, a federal coalition, by specifically putting on the back burner all the controversial agenda items on the BJP/RSS list. Now, once that was done, it was possible for Mr. Vajpayee to rule for the full 5 years. When NDA 2 came along in 2014, and Papiari called this, it was Team India, it was cooperative federalism, and there was a lot of lip service to the ideals of a cooperative federalism. I think NDA 3 marks a stark departure because all the contentious issues of the agenda have been brought to the forefront within months of the election. The item on Kashmir was implemented, and the state of Kashmir, for the first time in Indian history, a state of, as Mr. Qureshi pointed out, India shall be a union of states, but nowhere was it mentioned that at any point of time, the center could destroy the states at will. So this NDA 3, the problem that we are faced with is something that needs to be looked at very carefully, as I would venture to say unprecedented. There are points of comparison, but never to this extent. The second thing is that there is one type of democracy which is incompatible with federalism, and that is the pure majoritarian democracy. Federalism, by virtue of its very strong principles on the respect of the rights of minorities, negates that possibility that the majority, the numerical majority, is always right in all things, that it is omnipotent. That limitation is fundamental and inherent in federalism, the rights of minorities to have their existence and rights protected. So I think that needs to be underscored at this point. The third element that I would point out here is that the tendency has been to hear the states but not listen to them. If you have seen the forums that existed for the states to interact and to make their points of view felt, those have languished, those have withered away. Even the Planning Commission, all said and done, was a forum where the states were able to put forward their demands and their concerns. The Niti Aayog, which succeeded it, has become some sort of a ranking machine which continues to foster not cooperative, but competitive federalism, which means that it goes into the business of ranking states, and a lot of the work that it does is inviting bids and offers. Interstate Council, we know, has languished. So on that front, the channels of communication have dried up. The large number of states which are not controlled by the ruling party in the center have no constitutional channel to express themselves. We saw meetings of chief ministers which were selectively, chief ministers were invited, some were allowed to speak, some were not allowed to speak. Now, this is absolutely antithetical to the spirit of cooperative federalism, and the original design, the original intent of the founding fathers was something very different. It was a partnership. It was something which was going to work If you recall, under Jawaharlal Nehru, he didn't need to, but he consulted the chief ministers. He wrote to them letters, and there was a sense that this was a collective, joint endeavor, a partnership. I think that element is missing. Finally, I would like to say that, and Dr. Qureshi mentioned two very important points, and I think this business of one nation, one vote, and one election is, of course, utter nonsense. It would totally destroy the federal character of the country. As far as the All India services are concerned, they were recruited by an impartial body called the Union Public Service Commission. And they were assigned to the states. In their totality, nothing was kept for the center, apart from what it needed for administering its own union territories. And as Dr. Qureshi pointed out, this was a process of deputation where officers were asked, state governments then offered their services. The question that has to be raised here is, why is this arrangement being violated? Why is it that officers in the states are no longer willing to come to the center? I think that is the main question. Can't do this by force. The fact is that over the last 7 years, the conditions of service have deteriorated so much that a lot of officers prefer to continue in the states rather than offer their services to the center. So why I'm mentioning this is that there are a number of signs which indicate that the federal system is under severe strain and stress. And I think we need to wake up to this, because not only are the basic principles being violated, I mentioned about majoritarian impositions, but also on the financial front, the GST, much talked about, it was through a process of generating confidence. And I must acknowledge the role of the then finance minister, Arun Jaitley. He managed to convince the states of the good intentions and the goodwill of the center that they would not suffer. I think that promise was broken. When the finance minister did not give the states what was their due under the GST compact. Now, I think I'll end with this, is that federalism rests on a number of promises. It's a compact. It's an arrangement you enter into between the center and the states for sharing powers. Once that trust and that confidence is destroyed, working a federal system becomes difficult. And I think we are undergoing that phase where we have to carefully see how we can save what was a very well-crafted system, the original intent, and compared to the contemporary content that we are now confronted with.
Professor Arora has really, put everything in a very nice, capsule manner that, all these things have to be done. I think, the fundamental underlining factor, which I would like to mention here, is the democratic ethos. Federalism cannot function without the democratic ethos and a democratic ethics of a kind of a mutual trust between the center and the state. And I'm not saying this that, trust, of course, is a very big word, but at the same time, just after your elections and, after one comes to power, you cannot treat, different states differently. Then you are already representing the government of India. And, all these states are also equally to be respected, because it is because of all of them coming together holding them together is very, very important. So I think, that the principle of democracy, not just like elections, but, a kind of a mutual respect and dignity is very important for a federal system to work. And this particular thing, like the GST and of course the Niti Aayog, and even things as simple as, we have seen in the past 2 years with the pandemic, the way the states are struggling. And, I'll just give you an instance of mining, how, the center, there were these movements on mining, like we are talking about diversity in India. And, the state court, the High Court of Odisha actually, stopped it. But then mining comes under the central government, and, central government imposed it. So, in these kind of things, without having that kind of, of a talk, between the center and the states, if you're just doing everything one-sided, I think, that it's a big problem, because that is essentially you are also drying up the finances of the states. You are putting everything into your own, one particular very central kind of, financial mechanism. And it's a kind of a carrot and iron rule that, you don't listen to me, and, so nothing is going to go. And, if it's another state which is ruled by the same, coalition or a coalition partner, and, you obey and you toe my line, you get the carrot. So I think that is very, very unhealthy for any federal democracy. And I mention it, a democratic federalism and a federal democracy to function. India is not just a federal country, it is a democratic country. You cannot change just, everything, so suddenly. So I think, in that sense, there is no one prescription, Yajur. But I think, the most important thing is the element of democratic functioning, of, having that kind of a communication, of coordinating with the other, rather than just, I'm not saying that there will be no conflicts. Of course there will be, but then those conflicts need to be managed, need to be negotiated. You cannot just, it's not one-sided rule. I think, and that is what is a big threat to India's democratic federalism, democratic functioning, in the present contemporary times.
If we allow democracy to function genuinely, the secessionist tendencies actually decline. In fact, there are some states which are only demanding more autonomy. And if you take it as secessionism, absolutely that's wrong. The Union of States demanded that we should give as much autonomy to the state as possible. And secondly, now the Kashmir situation became so bad only when in 1989 there was rigging in the elections. The moment you tinker with democratic functioning, that is where the problem begins. A bad election led to the Kashmir situation, and later on 2002 and 2008 good elections, they brought back Kashmir. Of course, what has happened recently, as Professor Arora very rightly pointed out, I mean, just imagine by a stroke of pen, you can take away the statehood of a state. They cannot be the bigger bullying than that. And now, finally, I would say that I've seen it globally that terrorism has been abused for arrogating more powers and more authoritarianism worldwide. And everywhere they assume emergency powers. They assume emergency powers in a great hurry, and then they forget about the sunset clause and they forget to remove those powers. For instance, one case in point is AFSPA, Armed Forces Special Powers Act, imposed 30, 40 years ago. Nagaland situation is improved, the Northeast situation is completely changed, but that power, once that has been assumed, will not be given up. Now, this is dishonesty. The intention, you have to be genuinely democratic to in letter and spirit to keep federalism running. Otherwise, the friction is only likely to become uglier.
I think there's only one way. We cannot rely upon the courts, partly because sometimes they have lately been giving decisions that please the central government, not always, but sometimes, but mainly because the courts don't have the kind of huge political strength to turn this trend around and change things. I think the only way to reverse the attack on the federal system, the radical attack which is happening, is politics, electoral politics. The people can turn this around, as they have done in the past when they rejected abusive governments. Now, you might think it's rather unlikely that voters will do that they'll turn things around. But if elections are going to be reasonably free and fair over the next few years, that's a big if. Because, for example, the last Lok Sabha election, the ruling party had 18 times more money to spend than all of the parties put together. But if the election process can be reasonably fair, then I think this trend may be turned around. We have to remember that since 1977, about 70% of state governments have been thrown out by voters at elections, 70%. And since 1980, 8 of the last 12 Lok Sabha elections have resulted in governments being thrown out, prime ministers being thrown out. That's the norm. That's what usually happens. These rejection rates, 70% for state governments and 8 out of 12 for national governments. These are extremely high rejection rates by international standards. What that indicates is that the people of India are politically sophisticated enough to reject governments they don't like, to demand change when they see the need for change. They are sophisticated and they're also bold. They're active. They're not sheep. They're not to be manipulated easily. And this is an impatient, sophisticated electorate with a history of assertiveness. So it is not unthinkable that current political trends may be changed if the electoral process is reasonably fair. I should just say that one other thing, and that is the attack on federalism now is not just an attack on state governments which are led by opposition parties. It's also an attack, a weakening of state governments which are run by the BJP itself. They must fall into line with the drive from the apex of the system, from the Prime Minister's office, to control things, to homogenize India in ways like, if I had another half hour, I could talk about. And BJP state governments, BJP chief ministers have felt this pressure too. It's not just chief ministers from regional parties or of the Congress party. And so this is a really full-blooded assault on federalism, but it might be turned around.